Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this Lunch Bites seminar, Understanding Minds on Migration. My name is Eleonora Milazzo. I'm a research fellow at the Migration Policy Center at the European University Institute, and I'll be moderating today's discussion. For those who are new to the series, the Lunch Bites seminars are part of the Migration Research to Policy Collab and are designed as a space for exchange between research and policy. So short, focused conversations that bring evidence into dialogue with real-world political and policy challenges. So as you know, today's conversation focuses on a question that sits right at the heart of that exchange: how Europeans think about immigration, what they think about immigration, how those attitudes are shaped and mobilized in political context, and what this means for policymaking and public communication, particularly at a moment when migration, we see, remains high on the political agenda across Europe. So today we are very pleased to be joined by two speakers who bring complementary perspectives to this question. First, we have Fabienne Keller, member of the European Parliament for Renew Europe, with extensive experience in EU migration policy making and legislative negotiations. Welcome, Fabienne. Among other things, she played a key role in the negotiating process in the European Parliament at the time of the finalization of the negotiation of the EU Pact on Migration and Asylum. So thanks a lot for joining us this afternoon. And second, we have James Dennison, Pierre Keller Professor at Harvard University and part-time professor at the Migration Policy Center here at the EUI, whose research focuses extensively on public attitudes to immigration and their political consequences. So thank you, James, and welcome. And thank you all for joining us this afternoon. We'll start with short questions to each speaker, followed by a second round that goes a bit deeper into the implications of their work. And then I'll open the floor to Q&A via the chat. So please feel free to start formulating your questions and drop them in the chat as we go along. I will then read them out or summarize them for our speakers. So Fabienne, I'd like to start with you with the first question. So from a political and policy-making perspective, migration, we know, is often described as one of the most polarizing issues in European politics. So drawing on your extensive experience in the European Parliament, I'd like to ask you, how do you see the current political context around migration? What are the main challenges the current context creates for lawmakers when it comes to communicating about migration publicly, and also, as we know, building compromises in a highly charged and often simplified debate? Thank you.
Well, it's a big question. I must, first of all, I'm very happy to discuss this issue with you, and thank you to all the people who have joined us, because I like a lot to discuss about it. The perception of migration is something very important. I am by education an engineer, so I try to be rational and to find practical solutions to issues like migration, but it's very difficult because, as you know, migration is very much instrumentalized by far-right political tendency or parties and groups. And sometimes it's difficult to talk about facts when we see some of the discussions. And I must say that in the migration subject, the digital networks and the influencers play an important role. A lot have changed recently in the Parliament because we don't have at all the same composition we had in the previous mandate. You recalled that we built the pact, a set of measures, actually 10 texts. Out of them, 9 are rules. That means directly applicable in all the member states. That means that we have the same regulations concerning control at the entry. That's the screening in 7 days. Then the registration of the irregular migrants in a new software, Eurodac, and then for the people coming from countries with low chances to be granted an asylum status and accelerated border procedure to manage the large numbers. And then inside the country, the European Union solidarity mechanism, when there are more people coming in, usually in Italy and Spain, how can the other member states help them? Then this is the case where it's a directive, not directly applicable, how people should be accommodated when they are welcomed, and another text concerning the crisis situation in case typically we have a new Syrian situation where a very large number of people try to find the protection in Europe. So this was the pact in last mandate, fairly balanced between firm rules. There is a need of better controlling what's going on, but human. For example, in the procedure at the frontier, we have 3 months to have the procedures, but then 3 months with the people to organize the way back, the returns, humanly to accompany them. And we even have some centers in the countries of origin. Now, since 2 years, we have a different parliament which is unusual for us, we have two majorities. One is the traditional one around the center with the socialist and the conservative, the moderate right people. That was those with whom the pact was voted. And now we have what we call the Venezuela majority. That is the EPP, so the conservative, with the three groups of far right. And since then, we adopted two texts, and we are on discussion on the text concerning returns. And the two texts already agreed on are not balanced at all. They are taking into account the notion of third country. And in those texts, we are allowed to send people coming from any place to any other country in the world where a member state has established an arrangement, not even an agreement, an arrangement for them to accept this. That means, for example, people from North Africa could be sent to Bangladesh or to Rwanda, because that was the British model, or to Albania, where Italians have already a center. So that's a big breach in the spirit of the pact. And so my group, Renew, I am centrist, the socialists, the Greens, voted against this new concept. So we are in a changing political situation in Europe today.
Thank you very, very much. So indeed, changing political landscape, we've seen important changes in legislation, including the recent shifts that you mentioned, and important changes in political majorities. But James, let me turn to you on this point, because much of your research shows that indeed public attitudes towards immigration are much more stable, structured, and nuanced than political discourse often assumes. So based on available survey data across Europe, can I ask you, what do we actually know about how Europeans think about immigration? And why do you think there is often such a large gap between these underlying attitudes, what we know about them, and the tone of public or media debate?
Yes, thank you, Eleonora, very much for the opportunity to speak here today. Indeed, one could be forgiven over the last 10 years, 20 years now, for believing that Europeans have become entirely opposed to immigration, that public attitudes have moved in a more negative direction. And the main reason they can be forgiven for that is the increased electoral success of radical right parties at national level, almost across the European Union and across Europe. And of course, within the European Parliament, as Fabienne pointed out just now. So if you look purely at electoral results and you see that the main change is a growth in a party group whose primary position is opposition to immigration, probably above anything else, then you might think that that means that Europeans are becoming more opposed to immigration. But the data doesn't support that. So indeed, you characterize my findings on European attitudes to immigration as stable, structured, and nuanced. So what do I mean by that? Well, in terms of stable, if we just look at survey responses over the last 20 years of when Europeans are asked things like, do you feel generally positive to immigration from other EU member states or negative, or immigration from outside of the EU, we see basically stability. And on attitudes to immigration from within the EU, we see increased positivity, still pretty stable. Now, substantially, that's interesting that there would be stability, given the trends we've seen electorally. It's also scientifically interesting, because if we saw volatility, that would tell us, okay, that suggests that the causes of attitudes to immigration are something volatile, external, maybe news stories, maybe the latest thing that's happened. But stability tells us something different. What I argue it tells us is that attitudes to immigration, like most political attitudes, like most attitudes in general in life, are not entirely, but partially internally motivated. So they come from your own values, they come from your own psychological predispositions, and they don't change radically over time. If anyone in the audience thinks of their own attitudes to anything, but particularly big issues like immigration or redistribution or whatever it might be, you rarely change radically on those things. And certainly one news story is not going to change your attitudes. This is not to say media doesn't matter, and I'll come on to that. So that's the stability. Then the structure, I'll just say very briefly, well, part of the structure comes from the fact that attitudes to immigration are embedded in networks of other political attitudes. And as I say, reflective of dispositions, but also that structure means that, okay, we see stability over time in terms of average attitudes in most countries. But if we look at individuals within a country, we see a bimodal normal distribution. What does that mean? So a normal distribution means most people are in the middle and a few people are at the extremes. But most people will know what a normal distribution is. And a bimodal distribution, normal distribution is, or bimodal distribution, I should say, is pretty much the same, but we see two peaks instead of one. So most people can choose one side, but those sides are generally quite moderate. That's the structure. Okay, with few people at the extremes. Then finally, you mentioned nuanced. Well, I'll just say very briefly because I'm sure we want to open the floor, but Europeans are capable of offering consistently, and I would argue genuinely, opinions on different types of immigration differently. They are able to separate between different types of immigration, the characteristics of the migrant, the legal type of immigration. It could be family reunification, it could be student visas, it could be all sorts of things. And they have different attitudes to those things. But also we see nuance in terms of the type of question. So if you ask about these broad categories like immigration, they're stable. When we ask specific policies or specific politicians, for example, we get more nuanced responses. Now, finally, to come to your next question, Eleonora, you asked, why is there this confusion? And indeed, part of that comes from the rise of the radical right, but I argue that that doesn't reflect changes in policy preferences to immigration. Those are stable. Nor does it reflect perceptions of immigration, also fairly stable, if not becoming more positive. What it reflects is the perceived importance of the issue of immigration. This matters in a few ways. That is episodic, that is volatile. So humans are only capable of prioritizing a few issues at any one time in their own life and also in their political life. And when they prioritize an issue, they direct their behavior towards that issue, towards fixing or resolving or confronting that issue. So if you have someone who is right-wing, let's say, for example, and opposed to immigration all the time, they haven't changed. They were like that 20 years ago, maybe 40, 50 years ago. But before, immigration wasn't a highly salient issue for them. It wasn't one of their most important issues. So they didn't direct their voting behavior towards that issue. So what we're seeing is a shrinking, often, minority becoming more vocal. Now, finally, my very last point, how do elites and politicians often respond to this? Fabienne being a happy exception, I think. Those on the left often fear public attitudes to immigration, and when they see the rise of radical right parties, their fears, they think, are confirmed. Oh my God, they take the lessons from the 1930s and so on, that we need to fear what the public thinks about issues like immigration. That's what history, they would argue, tells us. So they're driven by fear that distorts their views of attitudes to immigration. Those, particularly on the far right, have a motivated reason to argue, of course, that the public is overwhelmingly against immigration, and those on the left just don't get it, and many on the left are actually happy to believe this falsehood. What this has created is a situation in which the far right have a permanent stick to beat other political groups with and say, you don't get it, we're the voice of the people, blah, blah, blah. And many are happy to accept that. Many who are receiving that are happy to accept that, which has caused serious problems because it means that rather than having a debate on immigration like any other political topic, where we try and come up with the most functioning legislation, policies, and so on, we're stuck in this situation in which a lot of people don't want to talk about it, and then one small minority group say that they're the voice of the public, which is not true, as I argue. So we need to get out of that, and part of the way is just understanding attitudes to immigration.
Thank you, James. So no major change in policy preferences or perceptions, but minorities becoming more and more vocal on issues that are perceived as highly important. I guess one big next step in the debate on migration in the EU is going to be the pact's implementation and its success. So Fabienne, I'd like to come back to you with a more forward-looking question. We know the Pact on Migration and Asylum is entering into force in June, and so the EU is moving steadily not only into implementation that's been well underway for a while now, but also into a phase of communication on the pact and its outcomes. So we know that there are also various possible scenarios for implementation and success of the reforms. So what do you see as the main political risks and opportunities in communicating, talking about the pact, its outcome, and its implementation at this stage? And so do you have any advice on how policymakers should think about explaining the pact to European publics in a way that is credible, realistic, attentive to public concerns, but without reinforcing polarization?
Important question, but I must say, dear Eleonora, unfortunately, we are not on time in terms of implementation of the pact. So one of the issue is to catch up. We decided in the law to give 2 years to the member states to implement. I must say they have, of course, done some work, but we are far from being fully in full application of all the measures. Because it's complicated, because it's a change in national rules. It implies, thousands of border guards, thousands of mediators, of administrative people dealing with all the demands. It means some, not so much the law, but some, because the European one applies directly, but some other administrative texts that are of lower level. And we have organized in the parliament a very efficient group following the implementation of the pact, so trying to push the member states, inviting the member states to present where they stand, inviting the commission. And for example, we were supposed at the end of last year to have a discussion about the solidarity pool, and the commission postponed it and then presented one, but it's not 30,000 people concerned, but 20,000. And up to now, we don't have the figures concerning how many people are really going to be moved from one member state to another. It's a fairly technical, but most of them are ensured through the conciliation, because people have already moved, so you consider that it's a de facto solidarity. So we are, pushing each step, but it's starting to move, and it's all about building confidence in the system we designed, but also in the member states just nearby. Whereas the history of migration is very national based and very centralized on national issues, saying that if we have problems, it's the next member states where people entered or where people went through who did not do their job. So but we can feel this change. We are lacking up to now being able to prove that we have better control of migration. But I must say that the number have quite decreased. This is a realistic situation. It's not due to the pact, it's like this. But nobody felt it. No one felt it. It's because migration, you don't feel it as a global issue. You see people in the street, you think they are migrants, and so that defines maybe your opinion. But they are not all migrants. Sometimes they are just poor people. Sometimes there are people who try to be to get asylum who did not get it. That's then they are not anymore migrants. They are in an irregular situation. But what is very important that we feel that the member states are really trying in depth now to put in place the accelerated procedures at the frontier. They stopped thinking about it. And we estimated when we discussed the pact that it took 2 full years to implement such a center, to hire the mediators, the policemen, the nurses, the educators, all the people necessary to have a correctly managed center. So we are on this process. I put a lot of hope in that, but will the simple solution I talked before, the sending people elsewhere, kick them away, push the member state to invest less in a more structural solution represented by the pact? I hope, of course, not, but it might be the case. At least, I guess, for example, in Slovakia, in the Czech Republic, maybe in Poland, they will try to threaten the migrants, but such solutions that would help them not having so many migrants coming in their country. So there is a real risk of lowering the force of the pact with this new text, and in a global atmosphere, where, as James described it, a minority has convinced everybody that it's a huge issue and that it's always worse, and that there are migrants all around you, and that they are all bad people, and etc. We have an horrible, criminals in France, for example. We talk about them only if they are migrants. This is due to the social networks and the way it's instrumentalized by the far right, and I'm very impressed by that. So yes, the pact is progressing, but it should go faster, and we are trying to push even more.
Thank you. And I think indeed there might be important trade-offs at play when it comes to implementation of the legislative reforms, but also measures that have to do with external migration management. So indeed, it's going to be a bit about squaring the circle in that respect, but building trust. You seem to suggest is going to be key both for the legislative and policy success of the reforms, but also when it comes to communicating about them. So building trust in the reforms, also in a public communication, from a public communication perspective. So James, building on that from a sort of research perspective, we often hear about better communication as an answer to polarization, to instrumentalization of migration as a policy issue. But the evidence on what works, to what extent, under what conditions is complex, is sort of mixed. So can you tell us more about what research tells us about how people process information about migration, taking a step back in a way? And are there communication approaches that we know are more effective for conveying evidence-based, factual information messages on migration policy, especially in context where trust is low, the issue is politically salient, and we're actually looking at rebuilding or restoring trust?
Yeah, so first I would just say, unlike understanding attitudes to immigration or explaining them, which is really scientific ultimately, of course, good communication is always more of a craft in that it's responding to a very specific situation. And I wouldn't like to second guess what communicators would say, but I do deal with a lot of I do work a lot on what the science does say about communication in general terms. And the first thing it would say is that the more corrective approach, which is something that historically I think institutions like the European Commission have tried to use, a sort of myth-busting or fact-checking approach. There's a place for that, but it does have its limits. And one of the reasons it has its limits is, as I said before, our attitudes are in large part internally motivated. And one of the key forms of that internal motivation are our values. So what we consider important, what we consider in the deepest sense, our primary motivational goals in life. So for some people, that's more things like security, conformity, tradition. And for others, that would be more things like universalism, benevolence, and so on. And none of these are objectively correct or incorrect. In fact, you could make a decent evolutionary argument that all of them have come to exist for some reason, that we need a good variety of values in any group in order to make good collective decisions. And I think that and indeed, when it comes to values, we know that we all hold all of these really basic values, which socio-psychologists have identified, but we weight them differently. So one of the key things on strategic communication is understanding the values of your audience and not trying to change those values. So if we understand their attitudes to immigration as coming, for example, opposition to immigration is coming from highly valuing things like tradition, conformity, security, then we shouldn't try to convince people that tradition, security, and so on don't matter, because they do matter. Rather, we need to find ways to show that immigration is not a threat to those things, and that even it can help manifest them. So a values-based approach is one way, on top of facts, on top of even fact-checking. Another key approach that communicators, I think all good communicators do anyway, is an emotionally intelligent approach. So choosing the emotions that you're trying to elicit well. Why do I say this particularly for migration communication? Well, a lot of migration communication goes down a route of, if it's pro-migration or at least anti-polarization, anti-radicalism, or even even just sort of more basic communication, a lot of it goes down a route of pity and sadness, like we should feel sorry for these migrants. And there's probably a place for that. But one of the problems with eliciting those kind of negative emotions only is that we know physiologically they lead to disengagement. So there are certain emotions like anticipation, like joy, like uh, there are others as well, but more positive ones that need to be mixed in there that encourage engagement. I mean, we all know how reels and all the rest of it work and sort of the dopamine systems that they use. So you do need an emotionally intelligent approach. And then finally, I would say the centrality of narratives. And this is something that I think the radical right, for example, have really mastered quite well, which is that humans think in narrative form. So that's really how we've evolved to learn lessons, which is this happens and then that links to that. Now, narratives are often quite correct from either side of a debate. They may often be strictly correct, but why they're very clever is that they're selective. So Fabienne gave the example of, for example, migrants committing crime in France, and some migrants did commit crimes in France, but it's more the selectivity. So that sort of narrative production, often implicit. So migrants committed crimes in this occasion, ergo, migrants are a security threat, which also has a values basis, of course. And not to mention the emotion of fear, that it's eliciting a heightened emotion which causes engagement rather than the sadness, which sort of is a dulling emotion. So bringing in things like narratives, emotions, values is a more sort of sophisticated way of communicating on migration and fits in with the science of how we understand attitudes to be formed in the first place.
Thank you, James. So understanding the values of our audience and rather than trying to change them. Thanks a lot. So we do have a really rich set of perspectives to build on, and we do have some time for questions from the audience. So I'd like to invite all of you to please post your questions in the chat, and I will then read them out loud, or try to sort of group them and summarize them. So while we wait maybe for more questions to come in, and again, feel free to type them up in the chat. I do have one question for you, for sort of both of you, because we often hear calls for making migration boring again, as we say. So I was wondering, what does that really mean to you? So making migration boring again, particularly in the context of implementation, what's going to happen in the next years with the pact fully into force, and also slightly building on your last point, James, is disengagement that we should be hoping for, disengagement, public disengagement with migration as a topic that should we be hoping for, or should we still try to build a different kind of engagement with this topic? Put this question to you both, but then again, please feel free to add more in the chat. Thanks.
I can start?
Yes, please.
If you wish.
Ahead,
I love the idea of making migration boring. In the sense, in French, it would be banal. You know, a subject like another one. Not something that is always on a high priority in the public discussion, but, you know, an issue. Migration goes with humanity since forever. People move from places where they can have good life because the weather is good, because the production conditions are good, because they feel well, to other places. It's good to remember that the Europeans massively moved to the States between 1850 and 1920, with exactly the same patterns as the movements we see today from Asian or African countries to to Europe. Take people taking long times, working on their way, being badly treated, paying a lot for the boats, and more so, the selection process did not exist at the beginning and was worse and worse until strong refusal to take the boat. I went in the museum of Antwerpen. I really recommend the visit there. It's really striking. And more so, you can give your name and your region and check whether some people of your families, a century ago or more than that, and a half, took the boat. And I found a lot. So, a lot of Europeans went to the States. So maybe in history, for my Irish colleague, they remember how many Irish died and how many went to the States because it was 25% of the population for each. So it's really linked to humanity. And so if we could discuss every year, calmly about how many migrants came in, why, for studies, for students, for family reunification, because they were looking for protection, how many might come next year, have a projection. We know we need labor forces through migration because our demography is negative and we are lacking in some skills, highly educated people, but also in care, for example, we need a lot. We could have a strategy where we tell how it's possible to join Europe publicly to people in Africa or in Asia, to tell them if you have that kind of background, then it's possible. If we could have that calm and control management of migration, that's the objective. That's even a dream for me, to make it as another, like economics or education issues or others, it being a reality as others in our society. But I think we have to go through James' recommendations, looking at it through our values. But how could we impose this type of mindset when we talk about migration? It's because I see this more practically. Everybody has hard views on global migration, but as soon as you talk about migrants, they know personally, persons, then the human aspect comes back. And yes, they work well, they are good neighbors, but they eat some funny food. It's more human, and so it's nice. So it's, but I am for years now trapped in this speeches that are taking over even the socialist countries. I tried to discuss with the Minister of European Affairs of Denmark several times about migration. The Danish are convinced that if you are not harsh on migration, then you lose the elections. So they consider it as a reality that's imposed, whatever the values that are in contradiction.
Thank you. What do you think, James? Should we try and make my migration boring, highly technical? Is that possible at all?
So I'm a little bit split on that question. So in some ways, I think that's, of course, if an issue moves down in terms of salience, well, one, that's often because bigger issues come along. So for example, that happened during COVID, that health and the economy became far more salient and people didn't consider immigration all that important by comparison for a few years. Now it's, of course, coming back in the last few years. And I do think lower salience and a more boring issue can also just be good in that it suggests that there aren't major failures or there aren't major controversies going on around an issue. So that can also be good. And then of course, there's the specific issue of immigration where, unlike economics, when economics becomes important, for example, cost of living, that's fairly evenly split between those on the left and those on the right, and they just have different answers, and then democracy does its thing of arguing about what the best answer is and electing a government according to one approach. But immigration is different, unfortunately, in that when immigration is salient, usually it's only one side of the political spectrum that finds it important. So this is a problem, and this is why in some ways lower salience would be good, because it doesn't mean there's this one loud minority voice and no other people just not really caring that much. So in that sense, it would be good for it to be boring. But then I'm a little bit skeptical about the plausibility of that and even the preferability of that, because one, democratic politics probably shouldn't be boring too much. After all, we want to shape the country or the union that we live in. And if it's too boring then and disengaged, then that's not healthy for democracy. And then that fits into that point I was mentioning earlier, which is that I fear that those on the left of European politics have generally been scared of European public attitudes to immigration and have mistakenly equated it with basically widespread racism and so on. Not to say that those things don't exist, but certainly not at the mass level that some have feared. So rather, I think it would be better if immigration maybe not became boring, but became normal and or even a little bit banal, as Fabienne puts it, and became an issue that was debated on. And the debate, which I would like to see on immigration, would be more about function and outputs and how to make it better. And that can be for people living here already, citizens, migrants who are already here, would-be migrants, and so on. How can it be better? And sometimes that will mean less migration. Sometimes it will mean all sorts of things. And rather, instead of that, we have this very stuck debate where the radical right say, you don't get it, even your traitors, and all of Europe is against you if you don't have our opinion, which is basically migration is a fundamental threat to everything. And often there's hints of massive duplicity from the elite on it. And those on the left being like, I'd rather just not talk about this. And I don't think that's good. I think that's really unhealthy for democracy. And I think that it doesn't lead to good policy outcomes either. It just sort of creates stasis or reactivity. And the pact, I think, is highly ambitious, and we'll see what happens with that. Maybe that will be the start of something more normal. Although in some ways it might freeze things. So I don't know.
Thank you. Thank you, James. Important point there on the value of these topics for democratic debate. But let me turn to the chat, because we do have a couple of questions for Fabienne and a couple for James. So starting from with the questions for Fabienne. So we have Alla Fedorova, who asks about Ukrainians currently under temporary protection in the EU, and what's going to be the possible impact of this large group as it transition to other statuses in the context of the implementation of the EU Migration and Asylum Pact. So what measures should the EU adopt after the termination of temporary protection, and how should this be coordinated with the pact? Obviously, we are also interested in the implications that you, Fabienne, see of this for the sort of broader public debate on migration and the pact's implementation. And then another question for Fabienne, linking back to migration as normal. So Terefe de Gefa asks whether is it rather than people do not see the history, the place, the importance of migration in the history of human development simply because of a selfish mentality. So is it possible, I guess, to really see the value of migration in the history of human development or not? And I think this is, yes. We have one final question for you, Fabienne. So this would be 3 questions in total. Valérie Quadri asks whether, from your perspective within the European Parliament, you see sort of narratives shaping policy choices rather than simply reflecting them. So migration is increasingly framed in terms of control. Is it possible, I guess, to reverse this sort of narrative, or have this narrative change policy choices rather than simply reflecting existing policy choices? Over to you, Fabienne. Thanks.
I will try to make it short for each question, so that James can have his questions. Concerning the Ukrainians, very specific situation for which the war started by Russia against Ukraine. So we activated a regulation that was not used ever. That was 10 years old, I think. That's the temporary derogation. We are still in, and no problem about the end date, because we keep on making it longer as long as the war is there. It's a very specific migration because it's linked to war. It's a large majority of women and kids. Few asked for asylum. Some did, but few. So it might be the case that the end of the war, which I hope soon, but it's already 4 years, might be followed by a vast return movement spontaneously. Very large majority of the people benefiting from the temporary derogation go back and forth because they take care of the family, usually the parents that are still there. And sometimes the husband that is not authorized to go out, so the family can meet again, and then they come back. So it's a very specific situation. And of course, Europe is following this and will take the decisions following the war situation. And it's a close country. Huh? We exchange a lot with programs. We have a huge help. We just voted the election of Peter Mayer in Hungary unfreezed 90 billion help to Ukrainians, a part for arms, but a lot for macroeconomic help. Is the values of migration going to change compared to the selfish ones? And I hope so, but since 7 years, I don't see the situation improving. It's getting in people's mind, and I am following 2 influencers of the French far right, and I am very impressed by the way they are able to twist, to modify the reality, to defend their standpoint, and to build a narrative that's promoting their own views. And I don't see the way. I don't see as many people active on the other way. I must say that a lot of people of the parliament have a migration background. It's interesting. You know, they are fighting and they build a position in a European country up to being a politician. Maybe we should, present them and explain their complete background. I'm sure it's the case in the society as well, but we don't talk so much about that positive aspect. And we say in politics we have to have 10 times more positive information to offset a negative one. So it's that maybe some of the people participating to the seminar can build that type of movement. Concerning the narrative shaping policy versus policy reflecting what is in people's mind at a given time, I must say we have to be elected to be efficient. So we have to take somehow in consideration where the opinions stand. But I I always need some time to explain my very balanced, very centrist position on migration. Whereas, it's so easy to say migrants are criminals. Let's send them out of Europe. That works. That was basically the principle of the two last texts we decided on. So yes, but Denis, we need your help to build positive narratives on migration and to make them find again an important place in the society, which is their place. And you kind of touch on it, James. I have an issue about the diasporas, who do not have a big political role, but might have, because most of them, are integrated in the society and could help changing the way we look at the new people coming, looking at those who have had the time to find their place in the European society. Thank you.
Thank you. So turning to you, James, I have three questions from the chat. So the first one, Philip Keegan asks, have migration narrative within political debates or media representation changed over time? So a question more about public narratives on migration. Then Julia Litsko asks, referring to how my migration attitudes are rooted in deeper values, she asks, then how do we measure that? So polling captures what people say, but how do we distinguish genuine attitude change from short-term reactions to media or political events? And Ferlin Asnan asks, do you think that greater diversity in media narratives around migration could lead to different policy outcomes and public attitudes? Thanks, Jane.
Okay, so on the first one, have narratives changed? Absolutely. I mean, narratives are changing all the time. So we all produce narratives and think in terms of narratives. So one of the amazing thing that narrative thinking does that makes it quite different from scientific thinking, for example, even though, of course, as I say, we all use narrative thinking, is that it links disparate events and actually really disparate psychological objects to suggest that these matter for each other and that they're related. So a good political communicator who's trying to push something on immigration, let's say opposition or favorability or maybe support for a policy or whatever, will link it to some other psychological objects to gain favorability. So some obvious ones with immigration would include, for example, in Britain, the European Union. So the radical right and Eurosceptics generally did a fantastic job of suggesting, look, if you want lower immigration, you have to leave the EU. It's the only way to do it. And this is a narrative, really, that essentially the EU causes immigration because it means that Britain doesn't have its own immigration policy. Now, like most narratives, that's partially true. That was true. There was free movement in the European Union, but it's highly selective. And Britain's history of immigration since we left the European Union proves that there's a lot more to immigration than EU membership. So then other objects that they can be linked to would be, for example, war. So I think that the EU did a good job in its communication. European leaders did a good job in its communication, although it's not just about communication, it's also about predispositions, of creating favorability for Ukrainian refugees who are essentially immigrants. It's a specific type of immigration, through this policy response, through the temporary protection directive and so on, showing that this is orderly. Of course, the fact that they're mostly women and children supports its own narrative and diffuses certain threatening narratives. But yeah, my narratives are changing all the time. I wouldn't be able to right now say what secular changes there are, but it's usually that people that that immigration, like every other topic, is going to be linked to other issues when those issues are important. So the war in Ukraine, EU membership, whatever it might be, crime, economic recovery during COVID. I don't know if you remember, but we saw a lot of narratives of what was the phrase that was used? It wasn't necessary workers. I can't remember what the phrase was now, but there was an idea that actually COVID proves that you need migration because the jobs that ended up we all needed, like food delivery and so on at that point, were being done by migrants. Okay, so then the second question was, okay, how do we know what genuine attitudes are versus short-term reactions to events and so on? Two parts of that question I would respond to. First, I wouldn't say that reactions to events are necessarily non-genuine. I mean, we do constantly update our attitudes when they're salient, at least. Actually, high salience is one of the few times when we see attitudinal change. Because most of the time the psychological object is just sitting in the background, not doing much. So short-term reactions to events are not necessarily ungenuine, but I would question the extent to which they change attitudes just because something as broad as immigration, we've been collecting information on that throughout our whole lives. So it takes a lot for it to be shifted. And we can know whether the events and so on are changing attitudes by using things like panel data or time series analyses, where we look at we question the same people every year or whatever and see how it changes. And what we see is not big reactions to events, actually. Okay, and then the last question, I can't actually remember what it was now, Eleonora. Would you remind me? Sorry. Or if anyone can remember what it was. It wasn't the selfish one, it was something else.
Yeah, let me find
Sorry
it
about that.
notes. Yes, so how do Asnan asked, so do you think that greater diversity in media narratives around migration could lead to different policy outcomes and public attitudes? So increasing the diversity in, I guess, media outlets, but also in the types of narratives that we see around.
Well, bear in mind, in the last 20 years through social media, we've seen massive increase in media diversity. One of the problems on migration, as I've said before, is simply that people who are opposed to immigration care much more about immigration than people who are in favor of immigration. It's just not a major political issue for people who favor immigration. So that means that they're not producing those narratives. Now, you could say that maybe the state should come in or the European Union should come in and do that. And maybe to some extent that's happening to create certain narratives. So
if I may enter
Yes.
there, by having regular discussion about the strategy for migration, how many migrants we need, in what kind of skills, etc., we would participate to that debate, I think, and make it, normal, as we said before. Sorry,
exactly.
James.
No, totally agree. I mean, I was just about to follow up with exactly what you said, that would make it normal. And even when you see radical right, for example, actors or even radical left ones drawn into discussions, for example, with something like advisory committees and so on, you see them have to suddenly take on this more nuanced tone because they're like, oh, wait, we actually need to come up with a solution here or a policy. How many visas are we actually going to create? How much money are we actually going to spend on border enforcement? I mean, Italy is just a great example of that, where you see large scale immigration, or the UK under Boris Johnson, that actually once they had to start talking about immigration, the tone moved away from this is treachery, this is all that kind of stuff.
Thank you, James. Unfortunately, we've come to the end of our time, so let me draw this discussion to a close. I think one important takeaway from today's conversation is that engaging public opinion on migration is not simply a matter of changing minds, but understanding how attitudes, people's values interact with political events, with political incentives, narratives, institutional constraints. And I think you've both highlighted very well that particularly at a moment like this one, when a major policy framework such as the pact is moving into implementation, this is going to be, so to bear this in mind is going to be particularly crucial. So on behalf of the Migration Policy Center and the Migration Research to Policy Collab, I'd like to warmly thank Fabienne, Keller, and James Dennison for sharing their insights, and all of you for joining us today and for your thoughtful questions and comments. We will be sharing more information about the next Lunch Bites seminar shortly, so please do follow us on LinkedIn or at migrationresearchtopolicy.eu. And we hope to see you at a future Lunch Bite seminar. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon and goodbye.